All right, guys, welcome back to a very special episode that I've been planning for a couple of months with these great individuals. It's a very hot topic here in Sri Lanka these days, and it's none other than a panel discussion on Starlink bridging horizons on Sri Lanka. So today we are just going to cover some main points that would, be very valuable to Sri Lanka and to an individual or even a business perspective. So we'll be just driving in to an introduction to what actually Starlink would do to Sri Lanka, and then how connections can go to the next level, and then an economic impact along with the cybersecurity aspect and the law aspect. So, introducing the panelists, it is quite a hard task. I don't know where to start, but then I was going to start it with alphabetical order, but then there's two A's. But then I'll just go along, go along with. So, introducing Oshada Senanayake, a digital transformation specialist and a CEO and the CEO of Brandix, and an ex-CEO of ICTA and ex-member board of directors at Asela. And along with him, we have Asela Waidyalankara, who have been troubling most, a cybersecurity advisor and managing director, Carlos Consulting. And then along with that, we have Thanuki Goonesinghe, who also have been troubling a lot, a tech law speaker and a lawyer as well. And then finally, the one I met recently, Asanka Abeysinghe, software and product technologist and the CTO of WSO2. Welcome, guys. It's been amazing to have you all on board, all in one.
Good to be here, Rosal.
Thank you for having us, Rasal.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for inviting.
So I'll just start off. I'll just put Oshad on the spotlight. What do you think? What can bring Starlink to Sri Lanka? Can you share the vision of bringing the whole Starlink project, the expecting a digital transformation in the country? What was the story behind it?
Yeah, good segue, Rasal. So this whole initiative started back in November 2021. At that point, the rationalization was, if you do remember, we had a very aggressive digital transformation drive in the country. And then we were looking at very significant ways of bringing in new ways of revenue into the country from a digital services perspective. So one thing that stood out was how do we bring in digital nomads, for example, right? Quite a few countries are really pivoting and leveraging on that sentiment where there's a lot of nomads today that travels across the globe as much as they work. So one of the key impediments that we saw when we looked at the scenario was, well, guess what? Connectivity. At that point, we're just coming out of the COVID situation, and it glaringly opened up the status of our connectivity. It was pretty bad, right? I mean, it's not a Sri Lankan thing at all, right? I mean, even if you look at developed countries, they have a situation of connectivity issues. It's a global imperative that the International Telecommunication Union has put into their Connect 2030 agenda itself. And also the UNGA Sustainable Development Goals state connectivity is a must today. So going back in time, how it came about was the fact that, look, how do we get that foundational element of connectivity up and running if you have to really even think about digital nomads coming into the country? Because, see, we have fantastic value proposition in what the country offers, right? And we thought, look, brilliant. I mean, we have the brilliant tech minds over here. Why not reach it out? And in fact, we started it off with the Asia Berlin Initiative with Germany. We had the first digital nomad coming into Sri Lanka back then. But then it was also important that we look at the ground situations. That's how it started, where back then I was at the TRC and we initiated the first contact with SpaceX directly. And we started the conversations in 2021 November. So the first discussions was absolutely brilliant. They were fully excited about it. And in fact, we triggered it. So typically a regulator don't trigger things, but we actually triggered that because we had a use case that we had to address. And that culminated in a series of further discussions. So the second discussion, if I remember, happened in 2021 December. That went into specifics, right? So we started talking about regulations in terms of NGSO systems. When I say NGSO, it's big jargon, but it's non-geostationary internet services. Typically, what we would have seen earlier was typical, telecommunication organizations setting up traditionally. But then, of course, remember we had certain internet-based internet service providers, but it was on non-geostationary orbits, not LEO, right? So we need to look at how do we look at that LEO aspect, non-geostationary aspects coming in, because there had to be a new realm of regulatory frameworks coming in, licensing mechanisms. So back then, Ofcom, that's the regulator in UK, that's what I looked at back then. They've been grappling with this as front runners. If you remember, it was not only Starlink, it was OneWeb back then. Initiative, I think that was started back in about 2011-12 as a startup, had issues, and then the UK government also invested in 2020. So we basically looked at it as a benchmark. We started looking at those questions. So we were having these discussions with SpaceX itself in terms of what are the specifics that they require to set up, right? Then we had to also look at other scenarios of how do we create a parity for late entrants, right? Because I mean it's a new area, and we need to ensure, as you know, spectrum is a very rare piece of digital assets. You need to be very specific about the usage of those. So that discussions was quite interesting, and then it moved on to a second set of discussions on the following year. I think it was about March 2022, where it went into further details, where we went into the usage of spectrum, for example. What other spectrum are we going to use? So typically, for use of non-geostationary satellite internet services, you can use many spectrums, for example, right? I mean, the V band, as you call. I'm not trying to make it technical, but that was about from 40 to 75 gigahertz, for example. Then I think we had the Ka band that was about 20 to 40 gigahertz. Then the Ku band from 12 to about 18 gigahertz. So there's a lot of questions we had to answer. So this is why it came along. So when we started, they were very interested, because at that point, back in the day, regionally they were been trying a few other countries, and they were having challenges, regulatory challenges, other situations. I don't want to mention the names of those countries, but even the pre-orders, there were situations, right? So we thought, well, look, there's opportunity for the country to basically get ahead of the curve. So that's where it all started. And then I think by last year, they've already made all applications, and had everything in place. And it was about us ensuring that we look at it. But I'll go into further specifics. You know, there are a lot of aspects we need to look at first when you go into a regulatory front. But this was the culmination of it. And hopefully, from what we're hearing, it seems like it's a go, hopefully.
Definitely, definitely. That's absolutely amazing on the drive that we needed to bring Starlink to Sri Lanka. So I'll just move on to Asanka. So who's on the North American end, and if you just share insights on the user experience of Starlink in North America and how these insights can be applied to implementation in Sri Lanka.
Yeah, I think good question, Rasal. So, since this is like a Elon initiative, it kind of go viral, right? Like it went viral as well. So, and then again, like the way they kind of put the technology, people are really excited about it. And as a technologist, I'm excited. So I'm not using Starlink, but I have used. I'm a Tesla fan, and I drive a Tesla from 2017, I would say. So it's not a car, it's an experience. So that's how usually Elon deliver this stuff. So I believe the same thing will come with Starlink as well. I think that is the momentum. But if you look at who's using and then how they are using, it's very interesting. So what is Starlink is doing here, bridging the gap between fiber and 5G. So that's the area. And if you look at it's around like around 150 Mbps that you can get max, and the latency is average around 30, right? So if somebody got a fiber, I don't think there's a opportunity for them to use Starlink. So that's the gap they are filling. And then again, if you look at the people who's using more kind of suburbs, urban areas, and then metropolitan, most of the people, they do have access to fiber. And then again, like after COVID, a lot of remote workers came into the picture, and people working from VRs, remote locations. So it came very interesting for them for them to get connected with a reasonable connectivity and a reliable connectivity. So that because of that, it's very popular. And then the next thing is about the user experience from the installation point of view. You can just order online, and then the standard dish is around a table size, and there's a mini one. It's similar to the A4 paper, and you can just follow the instructions, set it up, go online, get the subscription. You are done and you are connected. So that is pretty cool because you don't have to wait for a technician to come and set up this stuff. So you can do it by yourself. So I think with that, the user experience, what we are hearing is good. But then again, it depending on where you are using, what's the purpose that you are using. Because one of my colleagues who's based in Austin, he got one and within a week he returned it because it wasn't enough for him. So that's where I think we need to carefully look at the purpose as well as what type of expectation that you are having from the connection.
Yeah, but I'm pretty sure like it will be like a seamless experience, which not, most of us haven't experienced before. Yeah,
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 I
Asanka,
think
you would like to.
Oshada explain about the technology, right? It's
Yeah,
using this low Earth orbit. And then again, if you look at the dish, it's not a traditional dish, right? It has a phase array antenna with nearly 1,280 sub antennas, and there are more than 200 chips around it. And I think usually, even with the Tesla, what I experience from software, they improve a lot of stuff. So this is just the start. So it will improve down the line a lot.
definitely. Before we just move on to more use cases and how people can actually use it, if we talk about the cybersecurity aspect of it, I'm just moving to Asela. So, if when Starlink comes and then it enhances, how will it enhance the cybersecurity measures in Sri Lanka compared to traditional internet services? I don't want to attack them, but what what do you see the lift, or what do you see the driving of enhancement in terms of cybersecurity?
What excellent question. I mean, I'm just struggling to try to put it in a very diplomatic way. But what probably listen, all it's a different type of technology, because if you take the traditional telcos, they employ different protocols, different technologies. When it comes to Starlink, you have something like 6,200 satellites orbiting an orbiting cluster, and the way it beams internet down to specific antennas, as Asanga and Oshada very articulated very well, how it is beamed down and so on and so forth. So the technology, the platforms they use are completely different from traditional telcos. Therefore, I mean, space technology has been around for a while. It's been around since the 60s. So therefore, it's gotten better in terms of encryption, in terms of the security of the data. I mean, of course, traditional telcos have also matured in their own way. But of course, they have demonstrated that it can be used in scenarios that demand higher levels of data protection. Now, for example, if you take the Russia-Ukraine war, at one point, Starlink was used to command the drones. In fact, Elon got to know about it. I think he pulled the plug on it. But certainly, it demonstrates the capability of security. And of course, I think even if you see when President Zelensky makes his addresses via video conference, most of the time he's using Starlink. So the idea is that there can be the jamming aspect of that is very low, in terms of you have to really pinpoint the satellite. And as Asanga mentioned, the satellite dish is smaller than usual thanks to the Ka and Ku bands. Therefore, you really need to pinpoint that. So in terms of stuff like that, yes, but of course it's not immune to any particular cyber attack, because for example, if you take this is not Starlink, but if you take satellite communications, I recall something in 1998 where then US German satellite was taken over by the hackers, and actually they took over the transmission of commands. And what they did was then they pointed the solar panels at the sun, basically overloading the battery and basically making that satellite inoperable, and it crashed, landed several years later. So the idea is, yes, with new technologies, new platforms, the threat aspect, the threat profile also changes. It's an interesting choice, and it's an interesting problem for a regulator to look at, because certainly a regulator also has to step in and give certain guidelines, give certain rules and protocols on how you handle from a cybersecurity and a data protection point of view. So those are some of the key aspects, I think, that Starlink has to be conscientious of, and Starlink has to be looked at when we are talking about Starlink and cybersecurity.
Amazing thoughts. And then when I just switch on to like a law perspective to Tanuki, so what do you think, in your opinion, are the primary legal challenges that can be faced when we bringing and implement Starlink to Sri Lanka, and how they can be addressed?
So, one of the concerns that have been spoken about a lot is this aspect of national security and the legal challenges associated with that. Governments are often kind of concerned about relying on foreign satellite infrastructure when it comes to their critical communication aspects, and whether or not sensitive information will be subject to unauthorized access, and if there could be cyber attacks, etc. Because I remember reading very recently how even India, last year they were kind of revisiting their telecommunications regulations as well, very similar to what Sri Lanka was trying to do, or rather was doing. And at the point that they were doing this, actually let me pull that up because it's important, we can just quote it. So when India was looking at that, one of the things that they were concerned about was whether or not there were specific countries who were stakeholders in the in the company in a way that shared a land border with India. This is one of the concerns that they had. The issue has been resolved because Starlink had to provide a declaration regarding ownership. Then also there are certain KYC details and customer information of Indian users. They want to ensure that it doesn't move outside the country under any circumstance. And how, for security aspects, the government requires an undertaking from Starlink that traffic over Indian airspace and waters should be terminated at their local gateways. So there are very specific aspects like this that are being considered, like for example how the data beams from the satellites should only land in India and not end up on any foreign shores due to satellites moving. And this is, of course, these are very how do you say it? I would think these are very confusing aspects, even at this point, especially coming from countries like Sri Lanka, India. I mean, even on this side of the world, kind of looking at these things which are quite new in terms of like legal challenges is definitely going to be something to think about more specifically. And then there's also this aspect of space debris. And there was a kind of a situation where I think about 2 or 3 years ago, where Elon Musk had basically asked for permission from the FCC to launch, I think, about 6,000 odd satellites. But this was not cleared immediately at that point. Now it has gone through, but at the point it wasn't cleared because of this question of space debris. Because space debris mitigation is a complex issue. There are not significant like international guidelines on this or actual compliance kind of guidelines or any sort of regulations on this. So certainly that's another aspect and something that is new and alien to most of us. Okay, if you talk about Sri Lanka, well, it's not something that we are very, very familiar with, right? And so that's also going to be a legal challenge. How do we if we take our Telecommunication Act, so there's an amendment to it. So in that there are provisions to allow for new rules to be introduced, etc. So how would our rules really capture these kind of conversations, which are very new to us, is a challenge, and also something that needs to certainly be looked at. I mean, there are others as well, but I'm just going to focus on those two at this point.
Amazing. That definitely gives a hint on what we should actually focus in terms of legal perspectives. So my next question is something that really been asked when I just dived in audience questions as well. I'm just gonna ask it here. It's to Oshada. So this has been like a real problem in some areas as well when we talk about rural connectivity and rural areas that's not getting a proper network to it. So when Starlink's been implemented and the satellite is being taken throughout all the areas, I assume, what benefits do you foresee for these communities, and will it actually reach these communities or areas?
All right, very intriguing question, Rasa. Okay, so here's the thing, right? Now, as Asanka alluded to earlier, what we need to understand is this LEO-based satellite services, for example, Starlink, there are specific use cases, Rasa, right? So what we'll have to look at is when you talk about rural connectivity, there are other imperatives you need to look at in terms of digital inclusivity, right? One aspect is the accessibility to that service. Second thing is the affordability, right, of that service. Third thing is the digital literacy that people have to use that service. All of that three components has to culminate in that front. But coming back to your point, Rasal, see, that's what I told you. I think we have to be very pragmatic and practical about these solutions. I think today let's talk about the costs that Starlink has on offer on the other countries. There are about over 66 countries, if I'm not mistaken, today by, I mean, across all 7 continents, they've rolled it out, but about 66 countries, they've rolled it out. But if you look at the cost components, the startup cost, the cost of setup is significantly high. And we starts at about $500, $499 plus plus, right? Then per month, the services, if I remember right, started off maybe at about $80, but today it's about $120. If I'm not sorry, $99 it started
120.
off. Now it's $120 approximately. But however, right? I mean, when you look at it, it's a very inhibitive cost. But to be fair, by Starlink or any of these providers, when they set the price point, there are a few things they have to factor in. One is the regulatory costs of a particular country, right? You need to factor that in. Now, in Sri Lanka, on the old Act, which was Act 25 of 1991, there were certain implications that had to be factored in, right? Because there are components that you'll have to get in. One aspect was called the GMPCS license. That's the Global Mobile Personal Communication and by Satellite rule. That's gazetted in 99. That's the annual fee. Then there was another VSAT license. Then the question, one of the key questions was, hold on, while you pay for the service, do you also need to get a VSAT license as an individual? That doesn't make sense at all, right? So all of that key imperatives have to be looked at, and I hope that these are addressed by the new changes that's coming through. But coming back to your point, Rasal, rural connectivity, if these sort of services are going to be a meaningful option, well, there would have to be a lot of localization on that costs, right? Maybe on a gov level, there might be further discussions that may be had to have. But look, to Asanka's point, I don't think what we need to understand is this sort of lower orbit satellite services, there are specific use cases that you have. Now, if I tell, for example, look, a digital nomad who would want to connect from maybe in Kalpitia while he's kite surfing or while surfing in Arugam Bay or down at Yala, perfect solution because it's satellite connectivity, right? I mean, as long as there's no attenuation, well, you have access. But the fact of the matter is, then even if you have to have roaming facility, then there's another plus also. So I think all of these would have to be looked at. So that's why we have to be very careful with technology. As much as any other service, there are certain scenarios you need to look at. Now, take for example fiber, right? I mean, a couple of years back, if you look at the ITU benchmarking report for fixed broadband, we came up on the top 20 rankings for the cheapest broadband. I mean, it's not any localized report. This is the ITU report, which is absolutely independent. We cracked through to the top 10 in terms of the cheapest mobile broadband back then. I'm not too sure right now. But then you have to compare, right? Then if you have access to fiber or if you have access to LTE internet, then why does it make sense to go on to another option of satellite transal, right? So that's what I'm saying. You need to understand the exact use case and then you have to apply technology or services that's relevant. So again, as I said, unless there's a specialized arrangement, there might be. I'm not privy to them. Right now, as it stands, well, for me, cost is a major driver as it stands.
If I may add to that, Rasal,
So yeah, sure.
excellent point Oshada made, and also in terms of policy clarity, what part of the problem are we trying to solve from this? It should be something we need to, from a policy point of view, clarify. And I'll give you a good example. I think Indonesia very recently launched it. And Indonesia had a very specific reason for launching Starlink. They said there are certain remote islands that their broadband and their telco coverage infrastructure can't touch. And actually, the reason they partnered with Starlink was to ensure their healthcare systems and certain government systems are connected through Starlink. So there is a clear policy direction. You take, for example, countries like Fiji. Now, Fiji is a very country that's very difficult terrain, and therefore, again, infrastructure setup is challenging. In those countries, they are talking to Starlink, especially even these the Indo-Pacific islands, smaller islands, smaller populations. Starlink makes sense for them. So, just alluding to the point Oshada made, what is the problem we're trying to solve? What is the policy objective we are trying to achieve here? Certainly, if it's to bridge the digital divide, there's a lot more that needs to be done apart from bringing a global provider in, because as Oshada very correctly mentioned, there are a few more pieces in that puzzle we need to fix.
So assuming that the policy or the purpose that we are trying to bring is being already solved, or is it
No,
yet to be
Rasa.
answered?
So
Why we actually
yeah, no. So that's where it is, right? So unlike it's like any other service, right? Now take for example OTT streaming services such as Netflix, Spotify, or anything, right? There are still about 3 million households that depends on terrestrial channels. For example, you need to understand the socio-economic environment they're coming in. What's their affordability, for example, right? But that doesn't mean that everyone should or have access to it as imperative. They can still consume services. Of course, that will be ideal when they can, right? But it doesn't mean to say, look, there's no use case for that, right? So that's one example, right? I mean, back in the day, 2 3 years back, we were banking on VPNs to connect to OTTs, right? Now,
yeah.
today, there's a lot of consumption. In fact, eyeballs are moving on to completely OTT, right? I mean, today in Sri Lanka, people are watching even teledramas on YouTube, for example, right? More than the TV. So I think it's a must that we bring this ahead of the curve technologies, right? We have to as a country, right? We have to, because there are, I mean, see, think about it, right? I mean, if you're talking about digital nomadism and if you're talking about expanding our technology services across rural areas for inclusivity, you would have to have that, right? Organizations, for example, right? If you want to set up certain factories or certain entities across using our geographical spread across the country, they can use this, Prasad, right? Now, today,
Yeah.
VSAT services on a granular level are still being offered, right? I don't want to mention names. VSAT services are there. So when this comes in, what we are saying is it's an absolute must. I think we should be definitely embracing it, right? But what we are trying to say here is the usage, you have to be very, very practical about what's on offer, right? Because, say, at the end of the day, it's not going to be a silver bullet across all use cases, right? There are
Yeah.
specific use cases. That's what you need to understand. And then rural connectivity. Now in Kenya, I've seen a lot of examples, right, that they use it for, right? And in the US, in fact, also Asanka, right? Quite a few areas that they use, because there's a big debate now, even on spectrum, right? Even I don't want to again mention, there are a lot of debates on the 12 gigahertz spectrum. Where suddenly there was the satellite TV entity that was using it, and it's being used by Starlink for its downlink. Now suddenly the debate is, okay, hold on, how is 12 gigahertz going to be used, the QU band in the future, right? So it's evolving. It's evolving, and as Thanuki said, look, regulatory fronts and the legal fronts will anyway follow the ever changing technological landscape, right? It will follow. It's a question of how fast can it follow. And yes, there has to be measures and methods that we need to look at. But that doesn't mean to say, look, it doesn't have to come in. It has to come in, right? It has to come in, and then that's where we move forward. But what we need to understand is it won't be for every use case.
So the people have to be smart on how they use it and why they use it. Probably that
For
sums
example,
up.
it's like picking up your mobile broadband service or your mobile package, right? It depends.
Yeah,
Every user's requirements are very unique, right? Based on that uniqueness, you need to select the right options for you. It's the same.
yeah,
It's like a lot
absolutely.
more options are coming in, and that's good for the
Yeah,
country. That's good
yeah.
for the citizens.
Definitely. So then just moving on to Asanka. So I'll just step into the use cases aspects now. How can these IoT ecosystems leverage Starlink's connectivity to, enhance, especially something like real-time monitoring and also like in data collection in sectors such as agriculture, healthcare, and logistics, how this can be, used specifically.
Yeah, so I'll frame it like this, like it's connectivity. So Starlink can be one
Yeah.
way of getting the connectivity. So let's take it in that way. I think it can help in many sectors. So if we kind of highlight, I would say agriculture might be a really cool thing, because the main problem in agriculture, there are a lot of middle men and women, right? Okay. So how we can cut down that middle part is what the farmers require. So if the connectivity is helping to minimize it, I think that will be a great solution. And then with IoT, I think you can take the agriculture into the next level, and I think that's why the success, even so I live in northeast of San Francisco. It's more kind of lot of farms and farming happening in this area as well. So how they kind of taking it to the next level is using the technology a lot to make decisions, as well as have some predictive information, and then enhance the productivity and get the maximum out of it, what they grow, right? So that is one area. And then healthcare is something I think we can think about, because you need to communicate. And then if you have a better connectivity, I think you can save a lot of lives as well. And this type of a technology might be really useful. Then you have a reliable connection. Then the next thing is about the logistics, that because you need to have a proper logistics system within the country, right? So the having a reliable connectivity and getting the connectivity into the areas that you can't have other mechanisms to bring connectivity will definitely help. So I think going back to what Oshada and Asela explained, what we need to think, like a government is like an enterprise, right? So where you bring technology into an enterprise, also you carefully do that based on use cases. I think the same way a government should think about these things as well. When and where you bring this stuff, and technically an enterprise should be profitable in one way, and then enterprise should be have a happy set of employees and then happy set of customers. So the same principles apply in for a government as well. If you look at it from that analogy, I think it's easy to make these type of decisions. So that's where we have to be very careful, because these things can be buzzwords. These things can be kind of distractions to other stuff. So as citizens, I think we have to be very careful when it comes to hypes that create with different agendas as well.
Amazing. Uh, and when we just step into like the protection and the user privacy, looking at Asela, so how can this Starlink ensure the protection of user privacy and data security in a satellite-based environment? I'll leave this question open. Anyone can add their thoughts as well. Uh, what do you actually think about that?
I think I'll have to echo what Asanka said. In when it comes to cybersecurity, there are many elements in it, and connectivity is one aspect. How you connect, be it broadband, be it satellite based technology, be it some other way. But certainly, it is just the connectivity. What you send through those pipes, how those data is transmitted, how those data is sent while encryption, while it's sending encrypted at rest, Those are the important fundamentals that we need to follow in terms of that. That should not ideally change based on your connectivity. But of course, connectivity adds an element of risk as well as an element of, for example, disaster planning. So I'll give you an example. One use case, and I'm just echoing what Oshada and Asanka said here, is we can look at it in terms of use cases. So one use case you can have, and certain countries have used this, is in humanitarian disasters. When traditional connectivity is compromised, and your data is important to be transmitted, and connectivity is important to you, then of course, situation or a product like Starlink is imperative. And there are enough examples of that. Even in America, I believe they used it. Haiti, I believe, when there was a natural disaster, it was used. So on and so forth. There are situations. In terms of fundamentally looking at data privacy and data protection, it's just connectivity. And I think we need to just emphasize that, because there's a lot going on apart from that. But how can Starlink help is probably that if I was somebody who is looking at it, maybe this could be another way that I could consider in my DR plans, provided budgets do allow that. Because if traditional infrastructures fail and my business is business critical, connectivity to the internet is very critical to my business, then this is an option I need to consider. So those are some of the aspects perhaps you can look at when in terms of looking at this particular type of technology. But again, I want to emphasize this is just one layer. There is the device, there is the user. We have seen enough and more times how that there is the software. And you saw very recently what happened with the CrowdStrike, where it wasn't connectivity, it was something completely different, but we managed to bring the entire global, global businesses, air travel, so many other things to a standstill. So it begs the question, how are we looking at this problem, and how mature we have to look at this problem. So I'll end there, because my esteemed panelists also, I'm sure, have things
No,
they
yeah, that I think you summed it up very well, Asela. So I think I completely agree with Asela, Rasal, but it cuts across a broad spectrum of things. For example, you have to start off with SATCOM security, for example. As Asela mentioned, there's quite a few incidents starting off with February 2022, where there's a breach of a SATCOM system. Then certain German researchers found out mid-2023 there were certain software vulnerabilities in 3 satellite systems that they've just studied, right? So when you look at the LEO systems, the low Earth orbit systems such as Starlink or OneWeb or anything for that matter, there are multiple aspects that you need to look at, right? Security is intrinsic to every component. Take, for example, the ground stations. Today, Starlink has its own laser-based connectivity that might be a alternative to having traditional ground stations, but still you need ground stations to connect the satellite services to the internet backbones. So they have about 150. So when you talk about data security, you need to look at ground stations, you need to look at user antennas, modems, satellites, even business software systems, and including our own software systems, as Asela said, right? So that's where I think NIST has come out with a framework. There are 6-phase SATCOM security framework that they've come up with, Rasal. But again, to Asela's point, whether it be what service provider, they provide only connectivity. You are also responsible for your own data. You can't click on a phishing link or have things done that you have APT on your system, right? Or day threat coming in and put it on the connectivity provider, right? But having said that, SATCOM security is important, right? That's important. It's evolving, and it's making headlines right now as we speak, because information security and cybersecurity is entwined together, including personal information security and all of that. So you can't discount any of those. It has to work along together. But I wouldn't say that it's something that you can only put at Starlink. It is something that cuts across aspects.
Yeah, definitely.
And
So if you just,
Yeah, and just to
and
add,
just quick. Sorry, Thanuki, go ahead.
yeah, and just to add, I mean, there are some other things that we need to think about, things like surveillance and user tracking, which becomes even more easier with the prevalence of this kind of technology. And how would a government essentially deal with something like that? Sri Lanka obviously We don't have anything at the moment to provide any guidance on this, so that's something we need to think about. And also in terms of data protection, now we have a task to look at how, with the inclusion of Starlink in the picture in the near future, how should our data protection regulation also kind of adjust to accommodate some of the data related consequences of the use of satellite technology in terms of data. And that's something that needs to be considered as well.
Perfect. So I'll be driving back again to Tanuki. So if we just look at the legal landscape on how we are actually as a country supporting these emerging technologies and satellite-based environment, what do you actually see that needs to be more enhanced, or anything that you suggest on this landscape? What do you say about that?
So one of the so one of the things that we can look at is now with the telecommunication amendment. I think the only thing that kind of was adjusted a little bit to maybe make a connection to Starlink was that they introduced this term providers alongside the term operators, which is essentially extends that regulatory and licensing requirements to telecommunication entities like Starlink. But I'm not sure whether the Act provides a lot of clarity about things like, let's say, for instance, if you, how do I put it? Things like how would you essentially deal with spectrum management? How do you deal with okay, so there are some things like, for example, they have kept it open where they said, okay, from time to time you can put out rules on this. But that is quite vague. I do think that some of these very specific aspects need to be dealt with head on, which is being done by other countries. Even India is doing this. And that is something we need to kind of take on. I feel like the problem, I hope I don't offend anybody by saying this, but I think the biggest concern that we have when it comes to regulation in Sri Lanka.
So,
Okay.
if I may address all onto that,
Yeah.
see how it works, as I mentioned, on a regulatory front across the globe. See, even FCC in the US, for example, or Ofcom in the UK, or Singapore or Sri Lanka for that matter. I think what's important is that a regulator has to be pragmatic to move forward quite fast, right? And not all aspects can be covered in Act. That's why there are rules that you have to stipulate, and rules has to evolve, right? So that will evolve. But what's more important is that you're looking at the rules on a much more broader perspective, as I mentioned. For example, you can't get ahead of yourself with the hype, as mentioned by Asanka, right? You need to look at the future state of things, right? How do you look at the late entrance, for example? How do you look at setting up the ground stations? How do you look at scenarios that you don't require ground stations right now because look, it's laser driven, because Leo's orbit at about 27,000 kilometers per hour, and you have a contact point of 4 minutes. So there's a lot of beam movement from satellite to satellite. The maximum, I think, if I'm not mistaken, is about 4 minutes you can latch on to, right? So there's a lot of technology around it. So then we can't just say, hey, you just have to have a ground station, for example, right? But it is evolving. And that's what happened with Ofcom, even because they were looking at also changing their NGSO, the non-geostationary satellite services licensing regimen very frequently. So those happens across roles. I think what's important is we need to have people that have the right technological know-how, skills to ensure that you engage on those fronts, right? That's what's important in my opinion. And as Tanuki said, yes, national security is absolutely important. So when you look at the regulatory aspects, see, cybercrime is prevalent across the board. It doesn't matter whether it's Starlink or not. You need to have that measures to ensure there's national security. Again, Asela is smiling quite widely, right? You need to have certain aspects, but certain aspects that is well regulated and used for rightful purposes. That's what's important, right? There has to be governance around those things, and there's a lot of collaboration on a global scale that's happening as well, right? I mean, cybercrime Budapest Convention on cybercrimes. We were one of the first to sign up on that front as well. There's a lot of things happening, but I think what's important is on the ground. How do we continue to move and ensure we are ahead of the curve in terms of regulatory and legal aspects to keep in stride with these technology movements? Because as a country, we can't also fall behind. There's no way we can fall behind. We have to latch on to these technological advancements to ensure that we pivot on it. Our citizens pivot on it. Our next generation pivot on it. So it's an evolving phenomena that we'll have to grapple with.
Just a quick
Amazing.
one
So I'll just
to
drive back.
jump in.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Just a quick one to jump in, Rasal. Want to echo one point that Oshada made. You need good people who can understand the technology, subject matter experts who can understand policy as well as engage them. I know I have had the privilege of watching Oshada do that. However, how many skilled people we have, the capacity building we have in terms of a regulator is a question mark we have, because like Asanga and Oshada both said, technology evolves. Technology is always two steps ahead. Regulation, policy always comes behind. How you are building the capacity now, for example, yes, this is a new term or new way that internet is being used. Perhaps in the future there might be more. Are we preparing the regulators? Are we having the capacity required to make sure that the right people are with the regulators, having those conversations? And Oshada made a very good point. Space technology, space security is a evolving field. There's a lot of conversations. There's a lot of private sector operators now. There's a lot of private space companies. There's a lot of vendors. This is first of all, a public-private partnership and a conversation. And of course, there is a lacuna in terms of global regulation on this. And people are still trying to figure it out. Yes, country-specific regulations are there, but globally, Oshada, there is a bit of a gap. So what we have to understand is how are we going to work together and to harmonize our standards. And that's one. And I'll end with, because this has been spoken about so much, the ground stations, we don't really specify the physical security of a ground station. We might say, yes, the data security of it, but actually, we must think of security holistically. If somebody were to take over a ground station and transmit something maliciously, that doesn't have to be, as a hacking attempt. That can be a physical penetration attempt, and therefore the transmission station can be utilized to send something malicious. So, which is why the point I was trying to make previously also, security is holistic. You need to look at it in that point of view. Perhaps we need to maybe clarify in terms of ground stations as well, where we stand and how those securities look like. What are the standards that we are looking at? Similar to if you visited a data center, Asal, there's a lot of security and standards that go into play there in terms of physical security as well. Similarly, maybe we should have that conversation there. So I'll leave it there because I'm looking forward to hearing from the other speakers as well.
So I'll just directly drive into Oshada. So I think you mentioned about governance as well, but I just want to mention about e-governance and then how when Starlink comes, how will it support e-governance and how this will improve like government services and what chances will actually enable. For example, this is probably not in like a telco point of view or even a satellite ecosystem, but like something like Apple Pay, or that's completely different. But what type of new opportunities will directly support this whole e-governance and government using such kind of okay.
So Rasal, here's the thing again, right? From a e-governance or e-digital services or digital transformation of the country, there are certain infrastructure that you can already leverage on. So, for example, you mentioned about the public sector being enabled by digital services. For example, you don't have to wait for NGOSO services, non-stationary satellite services, right? You have your fiber connectivity in Sri Lanka. You have your LTE services in Sri Lanka. Those could already be pivoted and provisioned, right? That could be used. Okay. But however, there could be exceptions. For example, where we don't have connectivity, that is where the likes of Starlink could be leveraged, right? So again, I want to reiterate, It is not a one size fits for all. It wouldn't make economic sense even, right? Now, take for example, even something that I'm very passionate about is school connectivity, right? The 10,000 plus schools in Sri Lanka, right, could be fiber connected and should have been by now, for example, right? I don't know where it is right now. It was kicked off, right? Um, we don't have to wait for services like this, right? And then, of course, the exceptional areas, right? Let's say that you cannot have fiber penetration, you cannot have LTE penetration. Now, that's where for that delta, satellite services come in, for example, Rasa. And that's how other countries are using it, as you rightly said, right? The rural connectivity. There are different use cases, as Asanka mentioned, in terms of potential agri-techs and health techs in terms of IoT. But even IoT in Sri Lanka, LoRaWAN has been standardized a couple of years back, right? It's used by some fantastic startups that's taking products to globe on that front, right? So quite a lot of options as well. So what Starlink will bring in, that X factor where the exceptions can be now also managed. Then we have the new use cases. For example, we can get the digital nomads. We can have people traveling if they want the McDonald's of connectivity. Look, you can have the roaming feature. They call it portability feature in Starlink. They can use that as well. But again, you have to look at the cost. You have to look at the use case. It wouldn't work for everybody. But in terms of Sri Lanka, I think there's a lot of headway made in terms of connectivity. Right now, that brings to a very interesting point. Rasal is the regulatory aspect in terms of competition. Competition is key for a country to ensure that consumers gets the best environment they can. That's why we've been talking about number portability for the last 2 years. I'm not sure where it is. Everything was formalized. I hope it moves forward. But when you look at other entities coming, you need to ensure there's a parity, right? You can't have overlaps. So back then, when we were discussing it, also we ensured that there was no low overlap because it won't cannibalize the local space of the other telco market. Because as I mentioned, it's a specific user segment that it addresses. So to answer your question, yes, there are potential scenarios that you can use Starlink for, but that doesn't mean it is the general front that you need Starlink to continue digitalization, right? I've always been critical of that on the digitalization drive, how fast it has to move and why we are not. We've been comparing to other countries. Lot we can do. We have sufficient infrastructure today to do a lot more, Rasal, right? But of course, yes, when Starlink comes or any other NGSO services in the future, that will put us in a much more stronger state to continue to penetrate into areas that traditional aspects of connectivity wouldn't be able to service. That's how we need to frame this, in my opinion.
And also,
Definitely, yeah.
Rasal, just a
Yeah.
quick point. In countries like India, ideally, because Oshada mentioned it, this should, inspire competition. Now, for example, other countries, it has inspired local satellite operators to launch on their own because, there is something called Cube satellites, which is very low cost. It's open source. Parts are available online. Basically, you can build it. There's actually been a movement at a very smaller scale where they've seen what Starlink can do, and actually it has encouraged local entrepreneurship and local companies to take it up. So I think that is where we should drive forward to. And just to echo Oshada's point, Rasal, I mean, I know you asked this question different ways. Let me ask you a question. There's 10,200 schools right now in the country. How many have fiber connectivity? There's
Not
only
even close to 5,000.
I don't want to answer the question. I'm sure the stats are available to you. There are a few
Exactly.
schools, like Oshada mentioned. If you
Even
go,
LTE, Asela.
yeah,
Even LTE connections, right?
how many? Very simple question, and we saw the downfall, pitfalls of that when we had a restriction on the movement, and we asked children to go into e-learning methodology. We saw there were limitations in terms of spread. Now, of course, like as Oshada mentioned, there are schools. For example, in certain areas in the central province, Oshada would probably know this better than me. You cannot give traditional connectivity because the hilly terrain, it is impossible sometimes, Oshada, to set up towers. That's where a Starlink can come in. And of course, there are certain industries you can use. Now, for example, fishermen going outside the exclusive economic zone. Starlink has a different product, what you call a high performance satellite product, where that can be used for communication. And the fisheries ministry also has a platform that they use to constantly try to be in communication with these vessels and to do the vessel monitoring. That is entirely dependent on connectivity. Now, those are very critical things that we can use this type of thing in terms of e-government. But certainly, just echoing the fantastic point Oshada made, this is not a silver bullet that will solve everything.
I mean, so if I just ask on when we are already into the drive of the digital economy, but Asanka, if I could ask you, how does this Starlink's product? I think what Asela mentioned, like we already have like three different devices, three different versions, or even more, like to what specific way that we can use them. For example, like driving on boats and stuff like that. And then there's a business perspective as well. So, how do you see these integrations play a role in enhancing the digital economy, perhaps in a country developing region like Sri Lanka?
Sorry, I was on mute. So I think again, Starlink is just another channel to get this connectivity, and then based on the person and then the activities that they do, their geolocation, you have to pick these options. So I think linking this with what Asela and Oshada highlighted, I think we need to get the foundation first. Like having connectivity is not the only problem that we have to solve, because without the foundation, you can't optimally use these things. So what's the purpose and the objective? Objective is basically give a awesome digital experience for the citizens, right? So how you do that? Then you have to go through that journey. So there are three phases: digitization, digitalization, and digital transformation. Digitization is basically moving from analog to digital. So that's an example Oshada and Asela highlighted. We have the connectivity to these schools, and then get the digital infrastructure done and move from this analog stuff to digital. And then the second and the most important thing is this integration in between different type of digital systems. So we need to get it done and then have a common set of data. Citizens should be identified uniquely and one unique identification. All these things need to be done at the second level. And the third level is the digital transformation. Then only these applications and other capabilities that you can build on top of that. So without having the first two, no point of bringing the third level. So once we have all these fundamental stuff done, then this type of a connectivity can take to the citizens, and then the people can build really good applications, because now everything is connected and you can identify a person uniquely, and they will have a really good digital experience. And another thing that I would like to highlight, both Asela and Oshada mentioned about the not optimizing the local stuff. So even we feel it. So WSO2 is a US company, but most of our employees are based in Sri Lanka. But when we go to the market, even we feel that since people are treating us as a local company, they are reluctant to buy stuff. Okay, when Fortune 500, 100 companies are using around the globe, then we feel why they are not interested. I think same thing happening when it comes to every technology, that we are not looking at what we have internally and how we can optimize it and use it and give more opportunities to people and the organizations who's building this stuff, rather than we try to bring external stuff always because of some kind of thinking or a mental model that people are having.
Definitely. So again, I am targeting this question in terms of the law side. I think Asil also can drop into this. So when we talk about the international law and what they are currently around the satellite ecosystem, and then when it impacts the implementation of Starlink in Sri Lanka, what steps or what are the suggestions that it would be taken to comply with these laws? For example, when Starlink is used in other countries, in comparison with the law that we are bringing in or the law that we have, what do you see the difference? And basically an intro to that as well. This is for Thanuki and Asela.
I'd like Thanuki to take that.
Yeah. So when it comes to if you're just looking at some of the I think international law considerations that are there already for satellite internet and whatnot, you have. I'll just quickly run over some of the things that are available so that people get an idea that such things exist. So one of the main pieces of legislation is called the Outer Space Treaty, and this came up in 1967. Sri Lanka is also part of this, and it establishes that outer space is basically a global commons good that is not subject to any sort of national appropriation. Okay, so you can use it, but you can't. It's not yours in its entirety, right? So it essentially gives a responsibility globally to ensure the best use of this particular thing, that is space, right? So countries have to ensure, especially private companies like SpaceX, has to comply with this particular arrangement when they are launching their satellites. And then you have this aspect of the frequency allocation and interference. So the International Telecommunication Union is what manages the radio frequencies and satellite orbits to prevent any sort of harmful interference between these satellites. So before launching new satellites, you have to coordinate that with neighboring systems. And there you have certain ITU treaties and you need to comply with those. And then we need to also look at things like investments relating to satellites. So then there can be bilateral investment treaties if they meet the criteria of an investment made in the territory of the host state, etc. So you have some considerations there as well. Then you have things called landing rights and licensing. So providing satellite services in a country requires proper authorization and licensing, which you term generally call landing rights. When you're setting up ground stations, which Asela was talking about, when you're using spectrum, and if you're importing user terminals, they have to be subject to a host country's laws and regulations. So what you need to remember is you have the international laws, and by virtue of us being a global citizen, and part of these particular treaties or conventions, etc., you need to comply with them. But at the same time, you have your domestic laws and regulations that you need to get yourself accustomed to. And basically, there's a little aspect here which is responsibility for private activities, where under the Outer Space Treaty, countries have an international responsibility for any private space activities that qualify as national activities. Now, I don't know how far this applies to Sri Lanka, but this is something that needs to be considered, because it indicates that states have a strong incentive to supervise and regulate their private companies to avoid international sanctions. So that is relevant because even Asela was talking about these different local products, of course, not yet for Sri Lanka, but still it is of use to consider, considering that in the future this may be something that we may take on. And additionally, just on a separate note, I wanted to add, because I got cut off earlier, and it's also relevant here as well, is this aspect of consumer rights. And this is not necessarily spoken of so much in all these different conventions, but I want to put this forward here very specifically, because as much as we're talking about implementing all this in the country, it's important to, one, ensure that consumers have clear established rights regarding service quality, their data usage, have proper complaint mechanisms and ways to find redress, to maintain trust in this market, maintain trust in this particular technology. Because I don't see how you can encourage people to use it, even if it is in the rural areas, right? If they have no idea what they're using, right? And what is going to become of them if something doesn't go their way, right? So that those are some things that need to be specifically addressed. And I don't know where this could be putting. Maybe we have consumer rights regulations in this country. I'm not sure whether we are in a position to make amendments to those to accommodate satellite tech as well. But that is something that needs to be considered. It's something that is not spoken about enough. This concern on liability when things go wrong is often not something that is dealt with adequately in Sri Lanka. So that is something that needs to be focused on.
Amazing. Asela, do you want to add to that?
Couple of things, and I'm thankful Thanuki sort of covered the entire gambit in terms of what it is. I just like to add a few points here. I think just to echo her point, there are certain things that are not clear in terms of how we are going to operationalize it. Perhaps Oshada can give more clarity because he was the TRC SL chief at one point. Now, these equipment, you have to understand, is not installed. They are mailed to you, if I'm correct, my understanding. So then this comes through the postal system, and there is a customs consideration. So has that aspect been looked at, or how? Because we know, for example, if you do send stuff through post, there is a customs levy that comes separately onto that. Now, have these levies been harmonized and looked at in a holistic way? Because, for example, you are paying that $100 for the initial, I think, equipment and accessories. I think it's more. So once you pay that, there's the expectation is you have paid it and it is coming on the mail to you. Of course, then if it's held up by, for example, a postal department and say you have to pay an additional tax on it, I mean, stuff like that perhaps needs clarity. I don't know whether there is policy clarity on that. Perhaps Oshada can jump in and clarify. Secondly, just to echo the point Thanuki mentioned, and again, Oshada did a fantastic job when he was chief in terms of ensuring quality of service. Actually, TRC does, unknown to many consumers, TRC does stipulate quality of service standards to telcos. And in fact, TRC has a complaint mechanism, managed complaint lodging mechanism, where a citizen can say, my quality of service, my provider has promised me X, but I am only getting Y. And then the TRC SL is empowered to, in fact, investigate into that. Oshada can probably clarify better than me. However, what we have right now is these rights, and these, as Thanuki very correctly mentioned, these are not very clear to the customers. Now, for example, I'm sure, unless you tell a regular telco customer that unless apart from your telco, you can actually complain to the TRC, not many people know that. Also, the standard of devices. Again, I'm alluding to Oshada in his tenure. He ensured that the grey market devices are not in the market, which ensures, inefficient use of bandwidth and so many other implications. So we're talking about national security. These are aspects and variables we don't really look at. They're very sexy to talk about national security in a certain spectrum and a certain way. What is not really sexy is to talk about it in a holistic picture and to look at these things from a policy point of view. So I'll leave it at that because I think I pushed a few questions to Oshada, and I'm also looking forward to the answers on those.
Yeah. So I think quite pertinent points that Tanuki and Asela made, Rasal. So here's a couple of things that was very important. So even the Telecommunication Regulatory Commission of Sri Lanka, or be it any other regulator, they are full members of the International Telecommunication Union. Now the International Telecommunication Union has different segments, ITUR, that looks at the radio spectrums, the radio spectrum management frameworks, all of that. So interesting point to Tanuki's very particular point is that in 2022, one first thing that we did while the intense discussions was going on with Starlink was get ITU involved. So when Spectrum was requested by Starlink, one of the key things that we did was to reach out to ITU because it's quite new, right? How do you know are these the relevant spectrums? Is it the most optimized way of giving it out? So we worked very closely way back then, including the Secretary General of ITU really helped us as well in articulating these key aspects, right? Because we have to be future thinking, as I mentioned. I mean, the regulator has to think 10 steps ahead to be really pragmatic about what's best for the country. So, in that sense, ITU is completely ingrained on the regulatory front. It depends on how you engage with ITU. You have to keep tabs in terms of even the satellite front is managed by ITU, and even the satellite slots in Sri Lanka and all of that is managed, and there's separate verticals within the regulator that does it. Second point is consumer rights. That's absolutely important point. I think one of the most top priority items as far as I'm concerned. Again, you don't need new laws for this. The Telecommunication Act is strong in itself to do that, and the regulator is completely empowered to do that. And it's been happening. I mean, you've got to be fair with the positives as well. And it's been happening. But as Asela said, there's a lot of socialization that has to be done to ensure that these mechanisms are known by citizens and users. And quality of service, again, I'm not too sure now, but it should be, that information should be published on the website, right, real time, right? So anytime you should go as a citizen, you should be able to know by the telco service provider what their quality of service has been by month basis, for example, right? Back in the time it happened. I'm sure it should be continuing still. So all of this information is there. So again, at the end of the day, that acts could be there, policies could be there, rules could be there. It all depends on execution as well, right? That's what's most important, and that's where what we need to focus. I think yes, as Thanuki said, there might be certain areas that we might have to continue to evolve. That could happen. That's why there are the rules mechanism within any act, because act can't stipulate every point, as I mentioned earlier. But rules and other mechanisms could be initiated, just like the Data Protection Act, right? The Data Protection Act has a mechanism of the Data Protection Agency that can stipulate rules. So that's how it evolves. And I think right now those mechanisms are covered. But again, execution, well, that's something that everyone has to focus to ensure that the citizen gets the best service they can. And then there are all of the aspects covered in terms of with the right word, I'm giving the right word, the democratic provision of services, right? There can't be strategic lock-ins that citizens will get into in this type of services or any type of services. So that's what the regulators and the other policy-making entities has to make sure.
Perfect. So my main questions are done and we are out of time. Also, if I could just take like 5 more minutes to just answer like quite two more audience questions, because I think they are almost all the audience questions are done. So if that's okay, I can just ask just two questions. And I can leave it open to all four of you as well. So I'll just shall I ask all the questions at once? So then that will be faster. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. So there's obviously there's a controversial question about the price, but I don't we can't take it to
No,
here. But
that's okay. No, let's take
okay.
it out. So what we need to figure out is these are international entities, just like Spotify on Netflix, right, or Amazon Prime. There are standardized prices, but however, there could be an opportunity of localization which we are not privy to, right? So you need to understand that, right? I mean that we have to allude to it, right? But if there's a localized pricing, that will be fantastic. As I said, maybe entities could look at special use cases like schools. We don't know, right? That's all up in the air. But standard pricing may apply as it stands, but we cannot really comment on it. Am I right? Unless the other panelists have any other thoughts.
And data is a lot cheaper in Sri Lanka compared to North America and other countries as well at the moment. So it has to be something
In
favorable,
terms of a
right?
country, I believe it is standardized, but there are variations in terms of pricing for some countries. Now that conversation starts with the amount of internet users and the projected amount, forecasted amount of users that will use the service. And that's a negotiation. And like Oshada very correctly mentioned, it's the strength of how we negotiate on it to get a reduction. It's the strength of how the government of Sri Lanka negotiates on, for example, certain specific instances like fishing communities and schools and how they do it. So that part is really
Yeah.
up in there.
Yeah, and the base cost that may have to be absorbed by the entities as well. I mean, to be impartial, we have to look at that as well as well, right? The regulatory cost, all of that will have to be factored in. So as you said, yeah, it's a negotiation, and it's where you have to drive it to parity. As Asanka said, it has to make sense.
Yeah. So the other question that we have got is how will this be a support to our ecological footprint, and how will that enhance the whole digital footprint of our country?
I think we answered that before. I think
I
as well,
think we
right? So as
touched
you
on
said,
Yeah,
that.
I think.
Yes, we have.
we touched on it.
Okay.
Right? It's
Yeah.
about very specific aspects of geography that may not have internet. Then you can pivot on services such as Starlink. But I think we've answered it before.
One
Yeah.
thing you can look at is, for example, there are sensitive ecological areas that towers and stuff can't be built. There, if you are doing research, something like a Starlink, doing real-time research For example, if you're doing elephant migration patterns and you want to enter some data, yes, a Starlink would be very helpful in that situation. Or you have a collar on an elephant, and that basically is using a Starlink to send how the migration patterns are working. Yes, perfect. But beyond that, I think, like Oshada has
Yeah.
probably answered.
Yeah, and it's a disaster recovery, right? That's a backup channel for any
Yeah.
organization or
Yeah.
entity.
So the last question is, I think we touched upon these two, like the space debris. So it's like, how can international cooperation be fostered to ensure responsible use of space and address issues like space debris? And so say that we have satellites all over Sri Lanka, and in terms of rules and regulations and rights, who actually owns the space and stuff like that as well. We can just touch upon a bit on that.
I think Thanuki
So
has given
Rasan,
an
I mean, that's
answer
a
for
not
that,
right.
if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken.
I think Thanuki has done it, but I think see, it's an evolving subject, right? Now, for example, when Starlink came into being, there's a big issue of the when the sunlight hits it. I mean, there was a lot of issues on astronomy, for example, right? Then they came up with this dark set concept, right? Because when you look at right now, there's about 5,000. The target is 30 to 40,000, if I'm not mistaken, by Starlink. But then it comes this real scenarios, right? And the second point, as Tanuki mentioned, is space debris that can take months, years, and even centuries to dissipate. Those are things that is being discussed, and certain forums are being built up globally.
Amazing.
Yeah, and I think I'll add one more thing, because this is Starlink is part of SpaceX, right? The mission of SpaceX is taking humanity multiplanetary. So all these things should apply for aliens as well, because now they will come and connect, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
Tanuki, you wanted to add something to that? Yeah.
So I'm not really sure how this would apply as such, but uh, there is a convention that even SpaceX has to abide by, which is this 1971 Liability Convention. I know it's in the 70s, but it still applies now. The principle is very clearly set. There are two types of liability that can come about, and we can, I think, to a great extent, apply this to the space debris situation also. One is, and that liability in that convention is for launching states. There is absolute liability for damages inflicted on the surface of the earth or to an aircraft in flight, and the other one is fault liability for damage caused elsewhere, in other than the ground. So anywhere between the what do you call, the stratosphere or whatever it is, and anything below that. In both cases, the damage refers to personal injury or damage to property that can either be natural or judicial. It is, what is important to note here is that it is the liability is assigned only to the launching state. So, like for example, so SpaceX, USA, under no circumstance will that liability fall on us if there is space debris that enters into the system and causes damage to some property or something in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka does not have any liability in that situation. It will always be the US and also SpaceX, because it's not just about the state, it also applies to private companies that are private actors that are operating there. So I think in a way, we kind of there is a bit of immunity, but really I don't know how this conversation is also going to change. It may change in the future, because it can go like, if we are making a choice to accept this, do we not have a responsibility to ensure that said companies are held to certain standards above our space, right? So that is also something that may change the conversation. I have no idea, but just want to plug that in also.
In wrapping up, I just want to add it. I think in 2023, if I'm not mistaken, the Congress has passed something called the Orbits Act, something space sustainability. So under that act, certain rules were stipulated, and actually the FCC had fined one satellite dish operator $150,000 for not cleaning up its space debris. And the European Space Agency has this now policy of zero space waste approach. So there is conversations, as Oshada mentioned. I think what we have to do is, these are very national legislations. globally we have to harmonize in a certain way. For example, small states like us, our power to shape these regulations, it's sort of lopsided. But when we are linking up with global regulatory pushers, then it becomes easier. So best example is how we connect always to ITU, how our healthcare sector always looks up to WHO. Similarly, I think a conversation has to happen around those things. UNCLOS being a very good another example in terms of law of the sea, where smaller states, bigger states, doesn't matter, the equal rights are given to the sea. So similar approaches has to be looked at in terms of, since there was a question on space debris, and Thanuki did an excellent job of answering that. I'm just adding these points only for it. Thanks.
Definitely. So with that, we got to wrap up the panel discussion podcast, and I would like to thank Asela, Oshada, Asanka, and Thanuki. I think Oshada is the new participant to our podcast community. And I just want to end with one question that I just have in mind. If you have the opportunity to buy Starlink, will you buy it? And then you can just give the thoughts on our panel discussion today, and we can wrap this off. Asel, you can start.
No.
Oshada, I think Oshada would buy it.
As a tech geek, just to see how it goes, I might. But in terms of functional requirement, I have two fiber connections and I have my LTEs. So right now I don't have a use case, but certainly I will buy to test it out and to always be ahead of seeing what the experience is. I might try it out. But well, from use case perspective, right now I don't have a use case for it.
Okay. Asanka?
So I can buy it today even, right? So I don't have it. But so when I take road trips, main problem is connectivity. So even it is vacation, work is life, right? So I hope my wife will not listen to this. So to solve that problem, actually, I am planning to get a Mini. So that way I can be working while I'm doing my road trips. Other than that, there's no need for me. I have a really good 1 gig fiber network.
Tanuki?
Yeah, I would say the same as Oshada. I would just get it just to try it out. And if I like
Yeah.
it, I may keep it. If not, bye-bye. I guess.
If I can
Okay,
transfer
thank
to digital nomad,
yeah.
well, I might continue to use it, but that might be early retirement, which might be a pipe
Okay.
dream.
I think we are discussing
So
retirement plans now, Oshada.
Yeah. All right, it's been a pleasure, everyone.
thank you so much, guys. Thank you for coming today. It's been a wonderful discussion, and I hope the country and the community will take a lot on this discussion and whether they will actually buy Starlink. Basically, I pre-order it. Let's see how it goes.
Thanks,
Just stop
Asad.
recording.